Welcome to Rocket Ship, the home of epic React Native content. I'm Simon Grimm, creator of Galaxies.dev, and today's guest is probably the OG of courses. It is Maximilian Schwarzmüller, actually a fellow German who has been creating online courses for probably about 10 years. And we just had a good laugh because we haven't talked a single word to each other in all those 10 years. So thanks for joining me today, Maximilian.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, it's as I said before, like the world is both really small and big. This world of tech, YouTube, and online courses, and yeah, it's been 8 years now since I started releasing online courses. First course was released in I think February 2016. The time flies. But
Yes.
yeah, super exciting that we're finally able to meet and have this podcast.
Exactly. I think I started with Ionic 1, which is probably around 2014. I
Mhm.
started blogging and YouTube, and shortly after you came up. And over all these years, I got questions about purchase course from Maximilian Schwarzmüller. Do you know him, Simon? I was like, no, I don't know him. There's actually another very big tech YouTuber creator from Germany. I think his name is Philipp Lackner. I think he's from Hamburg.
Mhm.
He's doing Android. Probably never heard about him.
Yeah.
Super big. And on top of that, there's Just Tried Coding, also from Hamburg, currently doing a lot with Next.js. It's fascinating. Germany seems to be good for tech influencers.
Yeah, it's also fun because I mostly release my courses on Udemy, and there before 2020 they had like annual meetups, Udemy Live, in San Francisco and in Berlin. And there, I always met some German course creators as well, whom I obviously have never heard before of. But that was always fun to see how many Germans are actually in that space of teaching tech, teaching programming, and so on.
I don't know if we maybe like this especially, but for everyone who hasn't heard about Maximilian Schwarzmüller, as I said, you're the OG of courses. I just looked it up. You have 62 courses on Udemy. I always shied away from Udemy and had my own platforms, but you went down that road big time with 62 courses. You're AWS certified solutions architect. You have your own podcast by now, which I definitely recommend to everyone. You have Academind, which is on YouTube. Oh, you're going for 1 million. You're going to hit 1 million with
Yeah.
Academind. This is going to be amazing. But we're going to talk about interesting things. As I said before, usually this is about React Native, but because you know about Angular, Vue, React Native, Flutter, Ionic, all these things, we're going to try and explore a bit the edges and the overlapping things, where certain technologies shine, impressions you might get from those courses, from insights into the communities. But before we get into the technical stuff, maybe tell us, what are you working on these days? Are you working 100% on courses? What's a day in the life of Maximilian right now?
Yeah, right now is the good point because it always changes. But yeah, right now I am indeed working on some course updates. Actually, some updates for my Angular course. A rather big update, but I don't know yet when it'll be done. But I'm working on that, and always also kind of like preparing some new courses or evaluating some ideas because a lot of courses I think about never make it because I'm not happy with the concept or with the structure or with the recordings. So that's a big part, yes. And then I do actually have a decent chunk of side projects, be that our personal website or internal tools, but also some projects for friendly or related companies, if you want to put it like
Mhm.
this, like um, where I help them out with web development stuff or also with internal tooling. So that's something I also do, and I do enjoy a lot because it's like a nice alternative or a nice to mix it up and not just do courses. Yeah, so that's basically it. But at the moment, it's mostly course production work and course updates. Yeah.
It's so good to hear this because it's exactly the same for me. Whenever I do like only YouTube content and courses and Galaxy stuff, I'm like, I really want to like see what's going on in the
Yeah.
industry. Like, what are companies actually using? I'm doing the 10th version of the Superbase login, but what are the actual problems? And you
Yeah.
only get this if you do like consulting projects, if you're self-employed or something like that. So I totally see this. But I also imagine that keeping your courses up to date is like a never-ending story. You have
Yeah.
62 courses. Do you have like 4 or 5 flagship courses that you keep up to date? Because if you want to try and update 62 courses every year, that's like filling up the whole year twice already.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's impossible. It is definitely the case that there are some flagship courses, the best sellers, who have most students, the most active students, and obviously these are the courses that matter the most because there I have the biggest impact. If I update such a course, I help thousands of students, whereas some smaller niche courses who barely get any new enrollments, yeah, updating that course might push it a bit more. But as you said, since I have to prioritize in some way, it's simply not worth it or not possible. I'd love to keep them all updated all the
Mhm.
time, but that would in the end really mean never sleeping and working the entire year only on that. And it would also not be worth it because there are many courses who barely sell anything. And yeah, that's then just wasted time, unfortunately.
Agree. So, 62 courses. The interesting thing is, I never went down the Udemy route. I decided to use like my own store, Teachable back then, and I think you're still using Teachable for Academind, as
Yeah.
far as I can see. What is the difference between like you have all the courses on Udemy and it looks like you have the same courses on Academy Mind? Is there a difference?
Yeah, there is some difference. We have some exclusive courses on Academind. Only a few courses though, but the algorithms and data structure courses, for example, are Academind exclusives, and a couple of other courses as well. Um, but the main difference is, of course, that there we offer like subscription packages where you can get access to all these courses, including the exclusive, including all the updates, of course, for one low price. And there also are simply students who prefer to like support me or us directly, which is of course super nice because Udemy takes quite a big cut of all the earnings. They do the marketing, to be fair, and they do all the
Yes.
administration, but of course they take a significant revenue share. And on, as you know, on Teachable backed websites, depending on your plan, you keep essentially all the revenue. And yeah, that's why we have both. But Udemy is definitely the bigger chunk because historically, I
Mm.
grew on Udemy. As you said, I went down that road. It went really well, and therefore I can't complain about that. But you do pay a lot of revenue share.
Yes, you do. But I mean, it's the same like Apple and App Store and apps you put
Yeah,
out on the App Store. They have all the hosting, the infrastructure, and marketing, and yeah, therefore they're taking 30%.
yeah,
So,
exactly.
speaking of technology, as I said, 60 courses. If I just look into the list, we got React, Angular, Kubernetes, Flutter, GraphQL, REST APIs, Next.js, and so on. How do you build up such a massive understanding of technology? Because it's like many people know one thing good or maybe two, but it looks like you have covered the whole landscape. How did you achieve this state of being into everything?
For one, of course, over multiple years, and I'm of course not using all technologies all the time simultaneously. So for example, at the moment, I'm not working on any project that would use React Native. I still know React Native. I keep myself updated with what's going on, and I would be able to, of course, quickly get back into it. But I'm not using everything all the time. So of course you have to prioritize. And if I'm working on a course or an update, I of course work a lot with that technology upfront before starting that update. So that's one thing. But the other thing is also a lot of these technologies are kind of related. At least to me, it feels like that. I mean, if you Think about state management in React. State management in React Native is obviously pretty much the same. In Flutter, it's also very similar. So there are lots of similarities. Like all these frameworks and libraries have their components. They have their state in those components or in some components. They have typically some way of sharing state across components. So that's the same thing. And once you know these basic building blocks, I find that transitioning between these technologies isn't too difficult. Now, that of course changes if you then add things like Docker or Node.js to the mix, which are not frameworks and which solve totally different problems. Docker is, of course, a technology, so it's a tool. You don't build apps with Docker itself. You just use it to manage, in the end, the infrastructure behind the application. But that's just something I find super interesting, something I use a lot in these internal projects I mentioned, in these side projects. I like over-engineering some of these projects. I like setting up that Docker container and that fully automated CI/CD workflow for some basic tool that performs a simple task that I could run manually every day on my MacBook. But I like doing that. And along the way, of course, I also learn a lot about these things, therefore. And that's essentially together with the fact that I do this since I create courses since 8 years now, but I write code and I'm interested in that entire area since almost ever. I started at the age of 13, so that's how that builds up.
I think we've all been there, that we over-engineered our side project. I still remember like setting up the Fastlane pipeline stuff for my app builds, but I had no uses for that app. But I could automatically build and submit to the App Store with Fastlane. That's I think it just requires this genuine curiosity for technology to get into this. If you're not interested, you're gonna quickly lose track of it. But you said you're trying to stay up to date with the technologies you're currently not using. I found this quite hard after like doing Angular for many years and then getting into React and React Native. And I arrived in that community and I learned a lot. But I also noticed that, for example, like the Twitter algorithm is only showing me the React stuff at the moment. It's like barely showing me anything from Angular. And I found this really hard to just stay up to date with Angular and Ionic next to React. And I wonder, like, do you have any recommendation for staying up to date with that stuff? Because as you said, you're doing Angular, React, Vue, Node, Flutter, different technologies. So I wonder if there's like a great hack or a little shortcut to staying up to date with these different technologies.
Yeah, so for me too, Twitter is like the main source. I browse it multiple times every day, which is a bit too much, but yeah, I do that, and I do actually get a very broad range of posts. Thankfully, still, I do get lots of Angular, lots of React, lots of AWS and architectural stuff as well. So that is pretty well now, though I will say it also constantly changes. Like after Elon Musk took over, a couple of months thereafter, I started seeing a lot of weird stuff that I'm totally not interested in, that is nothing to do with tech. I just kept on seeing it, and I had to actively like block and mute and mark things as I'm not interested. And I did this a lot, and I'm still doing that every day to keep that feed cleaned up. And that works out really well. I try to follow key influencers from the different camps. So I have some Angular team developers whom I follow, some React staff, and that kind of generates a feed that works relatively well, I'd say. And what I also do is I do indeed, like every month or so, I simply Google all these technologies, like technologies I haven't worked with in a while, like Ionic, just to find out what the most recent posts are. I visit their websites and read their blog. Like most of these technologies have blogs or news sites, and I actively browse these sites like every 4 or 6 months just to get an idea of, hey, there's a new version, there's a new feature, a new service by AWS. I also watch most of these conferences like ngConf, ReactConf, and so on. And that, in the end, leads to like a ball of information, which works out pretty well for me, I'd say. Yeah.
I sense there's an opportunity for another side project to be over engineered. Like every month, I want to have a summary, really like a bird's eye view on tell me what happened this month in Vue, React, Angular, Node.js, Bun, whatever, in just like an easy digestible format without going to all the pages, looking at the latest posts. They sometimes have very technical posts. So this could be a really cool project.
Yeah,
We should work.
It's right. Yeah.
On it.
Especially now with AI, you could have all have it summed up automatically.
Yeah. I sense there's an opportunity, but not today. Today, we want to also get a bit into React Native cross-platform stuff. But before we dive into the cross-platform thing, let's take a look at the level above, which is Angular and React, and let's also count in Vue and maybe some new stuff. Because, as I said, you have a pretty good overview about what's going on in like the different fields. So right now, I know this is a bit biased because we all have some frameworks we like more or less. But what is your general point of view on the current the current JavaScript frameworks like Angular, React, and Vue? Which do you prefer for projects, and which do you think is currently the dominant word?
Yeah. So as I said, I'm currently working on that Angular course update. So I'm working a lot with Angular over the last months. I've worked with it a lot. So currently, I probably prefer that. But that really changes. Whenever I come back to React, I think, oh, that's really nice. Like so much slimmer and not all that overhead. But then I think like, but Angular solves this problem really well. So obviously they all have their pros and cons, and I'm not a fan of these like almost battles that you can witness on Twitter sometimes, because in the end these are all great frameworks, and one should choose the one they personally like. Or if you're working in a company, you probably can't make that choice anyways. But that's that take. But in the end, I think in the JavaScript framework ecosystem as a whole, we've seen that trend that a lot of these frameworks seem to adopt signals as of late. So that new way of managing state in the end, where you like wrap a value in a reactive object, and if you then change it in one place in the code, the other places in the code are automatically notified because the framework takes care of setting up subscriptions and so on. That's super interesting to me. I like that pattern a lot, and React is indeed the only library that does not have native signal support built in. You can add it, of course, with other libraries, but it's not a part of React yet, and that's something I find interesting. And I think in general, like in the JavaScript, in the front-end JavaScript world, we've a couple of years ago, there has been a new framework like almost every month, you could get the feeling. And we still have a lot of frameworks, and we have some new frameworks and libraries now, like Solid.js, which is relatively new. We have Svelte, which is not that new, but which is also changing a lot now with its adoption of signals. And Angular is reinventing itself since 2 years like crazy. And I think that's now an interesting switch where we're not seeing new frameworks like every month, but instead where the established frameworks keep on evolving and innovating, and where certain patterns hopefully become simpler or easier, where state management might become easier. And especially combined with another super big trend, which I see across all frameworks, which is that we seem to be moving back into the full stack development world. So like also like 5 years ago, it was very clear you use React or Angular and you build a single page application, you connect it to a backend REST API, typically, maybe GraphQL if you're feeling experimental, but probably REST API or REST-ish if you want to be super correct. And yeah, that was it. And now we like have this integrated approach with Next.js, the app router, with Remix also, and also with other meta frameworks, of course, where the code of backend and frontend comes together into like a single project again, but not just project wise, but also that the boundary between front and the backend kind of blends and is not that clear anymore. If you're using Next.js and the app router, it's sometimes hard to tell, will this code run on the server or on the client or on both sides? And I think that's a super interesting development. We're basically going full circle back to the PHP days where we all started, maybe, or where I started at least, where you like merged HTML with backend PHP code into one single file. And now it feels like we're going back. But to some extent, I think it's good because this separation between front and backend also could introduce unnecessary complexities, especially also when it comes to things like authentication, but also state management, where often you can maybe build simpler applications that are then actually more powerful. But that was now the big rant. But yeah, that's essentially my view on what's currently going on in that world.
Yeah, I think I kind of agree to this 100%. That we're going back. Yeah, people making fun of this, of course, that we're coming full circle on this. But I think the team at Vercel wrote about this as well, that yes, it is kind of true, but we're also back in a better way in terms of how things work now and how they used to work. And that this whole separation of front end and API was kind of made up along the way for whatever reasons, to like split teams into like, you focus on this, you focus on that. But that's just not the reality these days anymore. So we just have to like go with the trend. And speaking of the technologies, I actually used SvelteKit for my Galaxies page when I developed it like 1.5 years ago, because I watched a video from Fireship and I was inspired that SvelteKit is the next big thing. So I, of course, used SvelteKit. No, I kind of regret it a tiny bit. I mean, it's still great. It works great, but I also don't want to keep it up to date. I'm not really into Svelte a lot. So yeah, but that's just happening. And I also noticed that there's a lot going on with Angular, especially also with, what's the name, Analog.js, right? Is the full say. I witnessed the early days of Analog and thought, what a funny, nice little project. You're finally doing it.
Yeah.
And now it's becoming kind of like a really decent thing in the Angular world, right?
Yeah. It's the same for me. I also like recognized it maybe like 1.5 years ago. I don't know exactly. And I also thought like, that's ambitious. Like one person basically building this thing. And there's a lot of catch-up work to do with Next.js and Nuxt and Remix and all the others. But yeah, they really seem to making super great progress. It's also not just one person anymore, as far as I can tell. And I can absolutely see this becoming a very normal way of building Angular apps in the future, at least a decent alternative. And maybe at some point it even gets incorporated into the Angular CLI, maybe, that you can like create analog.js projects from that. So yeah, that's definitely exciting.
That would be so interesting, yeah. But also what you said about all these frameworks, and some frameworks gain like a market share more. Angular is trending a bit up. React doesn't have signals yet, while Svelte and others might have it already. It's interesting, but it still feels like React is dominating because of the ecosystem and everything that's just built on top of it. And that it's kind of unlikely that anything comes around that will disrupt this this state. There has to be like, we've seen that Svelte was good and Solid is really good, but it's not enough to like challenge React. You need something like completely different that is a whole lot better than React to challenge React. I don't know if anything has a chance to be like that over the next, let's say, 5 years.
Yeah, I also don't think so, at least not at a large scale, because adoption of React and Angular, but React is definitely ahead of Angular, but Angular does have a lot of enterprise companies using it. And adoption of these two frameworks is so high. And in the end, it is, of course, the adoption in companies that matters, because that's where the jobs are. I mean, we
Mhm.
have the luxury of using any technology we want in our own side projects, but that's of course not what you do if you're working at BMW. You're using what they're using, and if that's Angular version 4, that it is. You don't have to. You have no influence there, or at
Yeah,
least very limited.
it's so funny when you live in this bubble. You're following all the influencers and you watch like, oh, React server components and everyone's using this and it's so cool. And then you talk to companies like, yeah, we're using React 13 or something.
Yeah,
It's like the reality and what people pitch on YouTube or wherever. It's a completely different game.
yeah, exactly. That's absolutely the case, and yeah, therefore I agree. I don't see React or Angular going anywhere anytime soon. I think like 10 years ago, 8 years ago, where they emerged, like was somehow there was this opportunity back then. I think
Hmm.
because JavaScript evolved a lot back then, or did not have a lot of features back then. So we needed solutions like React to make certain things work, which nowadays would be a bit easier with JavaScript. But even nowadays, we would want a solution like React probably. But that's why they emerged back then, because a lot of internet related things were emerging back then. And I think it's far too stable now for anything new coming up here. It seems like in that tech JavaScript bubble, it's now maybe more the backend where interesting developments are happening, where we have like these alternative these alternative JavaScript runtimes like Bun or Dino, which might become more relevant in the future. Maybe, I don't know. And this approach to building the applications, that we build full stack applications maybe again, but the frameworks themselves, I think it's hard to challenge their adoption rate in the end.
By the way, in terms of the Node.js environment, I still use like the Express framework every now and then, and I remember that when I was into Angular, I was using Nest.js because it has a lot of similarities. Is there anything dominating in the Node.js space? Is it like are people still fine with using Express for the API? Or I remember there was like Harpy and Sails and like
Yeah.
all these frameworks. Is there anything that's currently standing out?
Yeah, I think it's similar to the Java to the front end JavaScript world, where if you follow like these tech influencers and discussions on Twitter, you could think that Express is totally irrelevant nowadays, and you definitely should use some fancy new bun specific framework. But if you take a look at the npm download numbers, which are, I guess, a fair enough metric for popularity and usage, most importantly, last time I checked, I think it was still like 22 million downloads every week, I think, for Express, compared to like 1.7 million for Nest.js or something like that.
Hmm.
Now, the numbers might be wrong, but it's definitely somewhere in that area where there's a huge gap. And it's probably the same. Companies are using Express because honestly, why not? It's maybe not the most fancy modern framework, but it gets the job done. It's easy to learn. It has all the features you probably need. You can enrich it with extra libraries if you need extra functionalities. It's stable. These are the things that matter in the end, I guess. And yeah,
Yeah, it's not always about edge functions and being close to the user
yeah,
and all these
exactly.
cool buzzwords. It's just like, yeah, just let us deploy it on our internal HTTP whatever server.
Yeah,
So, you said 10 years ago these things were emerging. And speaking of that, roughly 10 years ago, there was also Ionic and React Native shortly after.
yeah.
You have worked with both of them. Maybe we start with the one that came before. I think Ionic was the first. Are you still into Ionic? What's your current standpoint on Ionic?
Yeah. So at the moment, I'm not really working with it. Now, since Ionic mostly is just like a UI framework for React or Angular or a Vue or whatever you want to use, getting back into it would be relatively easy. You then also have to like learn how to access native device features like the camera, but that is also relatively straightforward. So I'm not currently using it. I would very likely be able to quickly get back into it. Um, but at the moment I'm not working on any mobile apps, so I'm not using anything there. But I have worked more with React Native and Flutter in the past years than with Ionic.
Yeah, that's where we come in a second. Just want to mention Ionic, I think, hit version 8 recently,
Yeah,
but I think both version 8 and 6 didn't have any like breaking
yeah,
changes, which is a good thing, but also means like there were not really like super new things. I think there was like in version 6 or 5 some major new components, but agree it has slowed down a bit. So for everyone who knows the history, Ionic was acquired by OutSystems about 2 years ago, 1.5 years, something
yeah,
like this.
probably.
Um, it didn't. They said they won't change something, but there's always some changes. I feel like it has slowed down a bit, um, which is not a bad thing. It is still a great tool for like building company internal stuff, but it just lacks a few things compared to React Native if you're building consumer apps. At least that's my point of view. So this also brings me to the question: what do you like more about React Native? Because you said you used it actually more than Ionic.
Yeah, good question. So I have to say, I think that sometimes Ionic, it feels like it has a worse reputation sometimes than it should have, because
Yeah.
whenever I have worked with it, it has been pretty straightforward. And obviously, I haven't built super complex applications with it, I have to say. But I never felt like, oh, that's lacking or that's super slow. So um, I never fully understood why exactly it was so much less popular than React Native or Flutter. Maybe it's just marketing. But I don't know. It might have real flaws if you're building more complex applications. If performance is super important, though then you might be forced to go full native maybe anyways. But yeah, I preferred React Native or Flutter over Ionic in the end, because with Ionic you're building an Angular or a React web app and you're wrapping it with a native shell in the end. And
Yes.
with React Native and Flutter, you're not doing that. There, you're actually building an app where at least parts of that code or almost all the code are compiled down to native UI components or to machine code. Um, and that has probably two potential advantages. One can be performance, and the other, um, that you're not restricted by what the web platform has to offer, or that you don't have to build all these bridges from web to native. Now, in React Native, you still do have that bridge because you still do write React code, which JavaScript code with React, which needs to talk to native code across some bridge. But the UI components, at least, are mostly compiled down to native components. And I found that sometimes to be a bit more convenient to work with, despite the performance aspect, since it felt more like an integrated approach. Yeah, and I guess that's the main reason why I preferred that.
Yeah, I agree that Ionic usually received a bad reputation. In my case as well, most apps were fine, but people always told me, like, you can feel that these are not native. And now that I'm working a lot more with React Native, I kind of get it, I think. When I use an Ionic app, I mean, it is very close to, I mean, they're basically replicating the native behavior with CSS
Yeah,
transitions, HTML, and so, or stuff. And of course, there is this bridge to like between the web view and capacitor and the native stuff, which will always limit your code. Like you can't run some sort of game with Ionic
yeah,
probably unless you're
definitely. Yeah,
using like a canvas stuff. So I completely agree to that. I also felt that with React Native, you're also benefiting in the most way from what these platforms have built. So iOS and Android, they've built buttons and views and text, and they all have these specific operating system features which are used when you're using React Native. And that would also bring me to like my the usual point that people have against Flutter, because if you understand how Flutter works, it basically in the past just rendered your application pixel by pixel in a canvas. In the past, I was using Skia. By now on iOS, it's I think using Impeller
Yeah.
engine, which is probably a bit better, but still they're basically not using what the engineers at Apple
Yeah.
and Google have done. So I feel like Flutter apps on the first look, and I've tried it as well, it was pretty good. It's an interesting concept. You got tons of stuff out of the box. It feels refreshing to not have a node modules folder that's like the size of the universe.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you get these drawbacks. Did you experience any downsides when using Flutter compared to React Native?
Yeah, it's exactly what you just described. I think Flutter has both the advantage and the problem that they're rendering everything themselves. And the good thing is that they're pretty much in full control of that rendering process, that they can do optimizations there, that I think the code does compile down to machine code. But yeah, on the downside is they're not using what's already there on those platforms. And you can also sometimes feel that, and you can also see it, like in those base widgets you get in Flutter. They have a certain look to them. It's all based on the material theme provided by Google in the end, and then it's styled from that as a base essentially, and that makes it of course a bit more difficult than starting with the respective base widgets that you have on these different platforms. On the other hand, I guess nowadays many apps have their own look anyways, and you couldn't tell whether they're Android or iOS, no matter where you're using them. But yeah, that's a thing. And I think one of the biggest problems I have with Flutter is they clearly tried to become this use it everywhere framework, where they market themselves as a framework which you use to build mobile apps for iOS and Android, for building apps that run on, I don't know, some smart devices, but then also web apps. And that approach, for example, doesn't work for me, and also kind of shows the flaws they have with mobile apps as well, because on the web they essentially start drawing pixels in the browser. Like they used to do it on a canvas element, I think. I'm not sure if that's still how it's done, but the downside is that you get lots of JavaScript code, really big accessibility problems, because it's all just one big canvas with pixels on it. So it might look good, maybe, but maybe also not, because it looks like a mobile app running in a browser, depending on how much you adjusted it. But it has all these problems. And I would have preferred it if they would have really like doubled down on their mobile app story, if they tried to improve that instead of going down that route, because now we have like these platforms which they support, which I will never use if I'm building something there. And they have like this huge widget catalog with thousands of configuration options, and that adds a lot of complexity that maybe could have been avoided.
Yeah. Just to add to the styling, I think they also have this Cupertino's theme, which you can set like as a base. I don't know how well it works. I think they still kind of prefer the material design.
Yeah, you can use it, but in my experience, it's really hard to use that as a base theme. It works for a very simple Hello World app with like a counter and a button, but once you start, at least when I last worked with it like a year ago, once you start tapping into some native device features, once you want to show alerts or modals and stuff like that, you have to do a lot of if-else checks and use different code for different platforms. So maybe that changed, can't rule it out, but that has been some complexity I saw there, which I found difficult. Now, that being said, I like working with Flutter. I always like building apps with it, and I think it can be a great tool for many use cases, just not necessarily for all, and especially, in my opinion, not for web apps or websites.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing about Flutter. And the funny thing is, I just remembered this. About 10 years ago, also when like Ionic and React Native were around, we wanted to build some sort of web project, side project, like a management of resource and tools. And I had no idea at that point. Simon was 10 years younger, and I picked Dart at that point for the web app. I have no idea. Like looking back, I have no idea how I came to the conclusion that Dart would be the best choice for the web project back then. But I actually wrote some that actually got me started with my blog. Like I wrote blog posts about Dart, and there was like a security package, I don't know, Riculo or something like that it was called.
Hmm.
And I figured, like, on my own, I was probably the first person to figure out how JWTs work with Dart. So yeah, that was interesting back then.
It sounds
But
interesting. Yeah.
it was interesting times back then. So I agree. Yeah, like the output from Flutter can look good, and there are some use cases where it makes sense. If you, I think actually BMW is using Flutter for their
Yeah.
app. So
I
if
think
you
so.
have a brand experience that should look the same on iOS, Android, and every platform, then yeah, of course, maybe you can do it with Flutter. Then like you can draw it almost like a game sort of thing, close to Unity probably. But in many other cases, the React Native approach makes more sense. You said about these downsides of Flutter. Did you experience anything like that where you really thought, this is not so cool, this is limiting regarding React Native as well? Or was all sunshine when you worked with React Native?
It's probably not all sunshine. Now there are some things in React Native that I simply never tried. For example, that mobile and web story, which Flutter has and which Ionic, I guess, also has. Um, it also exists in React Native. You could build like real cross-platform apps years ago already with the appropriate libraries and so on. And I never tried that. I never tried that because using React for web apps, if you know web development, is for me just simpler than trying to make a React Native web app work in the web. But that's one thing. Um, Other than that, I feel like with React Native, it still mostly benefits app where you have your own artistic style and design anyway. So if you really want to follow these native looks, or if you want to have that native look and feel, the Android look and feel, the iOS look and feel, um, I found that hard to implement with either of these frameworks, simply because they have, of course, some widgets. React Native has lots of widgets that are supported by these native platforms, but at a certain point, it comes down to taking a view and giving it some styles and then building your own components with that. And therefore, I think these downsides are similar maybe to what I saw with Flutter, but the advantage, or one advantage I see with React Native, is, of course, for me as a React developer, it's super easy to use. You don't have to learn too much new stuff. It's essentially like you build web apps. You even have your HTML code there. It's not HTML, but it looks like it. And so that's super simple. And for example, compared with Flutter, where it's all classes nested into each other, that is more convenient during development. I think so. It's small differences like this. I honestly can't say that there is this one feature which makes it much better than Flutter or vice versa. It's really just these small trade-offs, and I like working with both, but I found React Native a bit more convenient to work with, especially with React experience.
Yeah, I think there's there's a lot of stuff going on in the React Native ecosystem to make this dream of React everywhere possible. I mean,
Yeah,
it's of course this learn once, write everywhere. You can write a web app with React, and you can write a native app with React. And there are different approaches at this point. I don't know exactly what will like emerge as the winner. For example, the easiest way to look at it is you have a mono repository with a Next.js application and a React Native app, and they share some sort of component. That
yeah,
works pretty good. You get like the best of Next.js and like the best of web and the best of mobile. However, with Expo and Expo Router, they're also allowing Expo Web, and it's kind of interesting what's possible. With Expo Router version 3, they're gonna soon have like version 4 coming out. And a few weeks or months ago, there was this library open source React Strict DOM from
yeah,
Meta, which kind of like allows you to write a native app with these HTML
yeah,
views. I mean, that was a bit cryptic still, but it was a very early version. So there's a lot going on, and
yeah.
I'm curious where we'll go in the future.
Yeah, definitely. Totally agree. And I mean, you have to say, when you build a React Native app, you have like these two main routes. You can use Expo or you can not use Expo. And I've pretty much always used Expo, I have to say. I've played around with non-Expo apps. But of course, when you use Expo, it's, to me, it's so much easier. Of course, the downside is you have like all that extra overhead from Expo. You could argue if it's then still like a real native application, but it does offer a lot of things. Expo offers a lot of things that really streamlines this process. As you said, like the web app is basically included. I think like I don't know when they started doing that super actively. Like it was already the case 2 years ago. I'm pretty sure about that.
Hmm.
The Expo router, the new versions with the file-based routing, which now also explores that full stack area
Right.
where
Yeah.
you can where you build full stack native apps, and that's all super interesting. And um, now that I think of it, we talked at the beginning about the separation of front end and back end and how we ended up there, and that maybe full stack is the better approach. Um, it's maybe we ended up there because with mobile apps you always had this strict separation, and it's super interesting to see that getting broken up a bit, where you of course still have an API there, but if you build it such that it's really tied together and that it gets easier for you as a developer, that's all really interesting.
Yeah, and to top it off, I mean, Expo API routes are super interesting. But what I've seen now is that React Server components will also be
Yeah,
possible with React Native. So have like a native app with server components.
yeah,
It's like this mind blowing meme,
yeah,
right?
absolutely.
I don't know where we will go, but I also took a note. I just wanted to mention because you said the bridge in React Native applications is always problematic. This is becoming better now. With I think just days ago there was the new React Native version, which made the new architecture the
Hmm.
default at this
Hmm.
point, and there will be like JSI. So this whole bridge concept is going to be improved massively.
Yeah.
I don't know when the community as a whole will like take on this concept. Some libraries are already ready for this and prepared, some not. Might still take some time. Maybe when React Native version 1 is dropped.
Yeah. Let's see if that ever becomes a thing.
I think it will happen this year. I heard rumors that it's going to happen
Oh,
this
okay,
year.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they did it with React, where they suddenly jumped to version 16.
Crazy versioning hell. So talking about the future, we've talked about Ionic capacitor, which is kind of taking a backseat right now.
Yeah,
Then we got React Native, of course, going strong. We got Flutter, which is still, to my surprise, going very very strong. Like I made
yeah,
a little research a while ago. If you just look at YouTube comments, you will get the impression that Flutter is the best thing on earth, that you should learn it if you want to have a job in the next year. Um, I don't know if the Flutter team is really great with marketing and all these people are raving about it. It I honestly don't know exactly, but what is your feeling about like the future of cross-platform and the tools we have? And we also have like Tori, which is
yeah.
kind of unknown, but also like super interesting.
Yeah, Tori is super interesting. I wrote about it in one of our newsletter editions. The not the last one, but the one before that, I think, because it is a super interesting project. Exactly, using Rust, which at least
Just
could,
the hype.
yeah, it's a hype, absolutely, but it could, of course, theoretically also mean like great performance, though that's not automatically the case just because it's Rust. But anyways, yeah, that's interesting. And um, in general, I think this cross-platform, um, and not hype, but this will stay a thing, I guess, because obviously it has a couple of huge advantages. The biggest advantage probably being that you don't need to learn two separate languages, and then maybe some frameworks or libraries you need to use with these languages, and you don't need to dive into two separate ecosystems, which also should not be underestimated. So that is, of course, a huge advantage. And I think for many apps it doesn't necessarily make sense to learn these two separate languages, because yeah, there are disadvantages and trade-offs when using Flutter or React Native, but there also are disadvantages and trade-offs when not doing that. For example, that you have to learn two languages. And I guess for many companies and developers, that's just not worth it, because if you can get 90% to the goal with the cross-platform frameworks, that's probably good enough. Maybe it's even more than that. Maybe it's 95%. Doesn't matter. But I feel like that is definitely a thing that's here to stay. And I do remember that, like, 4 years ago or something like that, Airbnb like announced that they're not using React Native anymore, and that was like a big thing. And now React Native is dying. But I think it's important to keep in mind that not everyone's Airbnb. Not everyone has like hundreds of engineers and separate teams for separate platforms. Not everyone needs that last inch of performance, which I guess Airbnb also doesn't necessarily need, but not everyone needs that. It's perfectly fine if you have like an app that's super, super solid and that can be maintained by like a small team. And therefore, I think that's definitely the future for many companies and developers.
Yeah, the Airbnb story is probably similar to, I don't know which year exactly it was, but when Zuck said that betting on HTML5 was the worst thing that Facebook did, and it killed all the like Cordova approaches and all these apps. And then I also told people like, are you Facebook? You're not Facebook, not even close to it.
Yeah.
So we should always keep that in mind in terms of being practical. By the way, I just noticed announcing the Tori V2 beta release, Tori plus mobile. So for everyone adventurous and interested, go check out Tori. I still haven't had the chance to work with it, but it definitely looks interesting and like a worthy contender. I think 1 or 2 years ago in the Stack Overflow or State of JS survey, it was very like the biggest trending library, I think 1 or 2 years probably ago. So something to keep an eye on. And I agree that you said there are disadvantages in choosing a native platform as well. Like if you're using Swift or iOS as an example, you don't get the like hot reload that you used to from React Native, or like these people would probably kill to have that feature that we just save our code and it's instantly there. I mean, they have the playground, which is interesting as well, but it's different. It's different. So
and they have to work with Xcode.
Yeah, they do. I've worked with it some time. I've been an iOS engineer before. It was an interesting time, especially with Objective-C and all these brackets. But gotten way better with Swift.
Yeah.
So there was a great overview about a lot of things today, I think. I just want to mention, because we talked about staying up to date, there's another podcast besides, of course, Maximilian's podcast, which I recommend to everyone as well. Check that out. But I personally also listen to the Front End Fire podcast, which comes out like once a week. It's with Jack Harrington, TJ Van Tol, and Paige Niederinghaus. It's like 30, 40 minutes. They cover the latest news, and they also always share something that they're happy about in the week, which is more often than not, I found a good recommendation for a Netflix series that Paige was watching. So that's definitely a great, easy podcast to stay up to date. So last question, because you have taught millions of people. I think we can say millions at this point. Yeah. What are your tips, not to stay up to date, but to learn better? Have you seen any patterns that help people to really learn the stuff faster, better, in a better way than just consuming and watching? Is there anything that you notice over the years that really helps people to get into the technology?
Yeah, so I think it's the boring answer, but you need to build stuff. Like watching tutorials and courses, reading tutorials and books and docs is all great, all useful. And I create these courses for a reason. I think they're genuinely helpful, but only to a certain point. You need to use that knowledge and start building stuff. And you will absolutely also like hit roadblocks along the way. No matter what you're building, you'll have some problem with that demo app or some feature which you haven't learned before how to solve or how to implement. And that's then the part where you become better and where you really become a developer, where you have to like search for solutions on your own. And I also would recommend that you don't just use AI for the solution then, because it might be flawed, it might be outdated, and even if it's correct, you don't learn why it worked and what's happening here. And therefore, that's what I recommend to all my students as well. Once you finished a course, or even before you did that, because these are huge courses, maybe after a couple of hours, look at some websites. If you're doing web development, look at some apps and build very simple clones of them. Build your own Amazon, of course, without all the super advanced features, but build like an online shop with products, with a cart, with a checkout page. And if you're feeling like it, integrate Stripe with their sandbox playground. And you will hit so many problems when doing that, and you will learn so much. And so therefore, that is in the end what I recommend everyone, that you apply your knowledge like this.
I couldn't agree more. So for everyone, over-engineer your side project.
Yeah.
that's the way to learn.
Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing. Maximilian, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're busy. We're both kind of busy creators. So where can people find out more about you and what you're currently doing?
Yeah, so obviously I have my Udemy courses, the page there where you can take a look if there is some course maybe for you as well. I do have a few. You can definitely also check out the Academon YouTube channel, which I have together with Manuel, my business partner in the end, with whom I also work. You can check out my own YouTube channel. If you simply search my name on YouTube, it hopefully shows up there. Academite.com is our website. And yeah, in general, thankfully, I've reached the state. If you Google my name, you can find my LinkedIn page, and whichever platform you're on, I'm maybe too, just not on TikTok or so. That's I'm not active there.
Amazing. I also was finally able to, when my name is Googled, I usually now show up at the top. There was a wrestling star who had the same name like me, who was at the top. And I think at this point I come up as well. So thank you so much for taking the time. All the best for your next course, and hope to see you again on the podcast in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Bye.
Bye.